She thought she'd bought the wrong horse, until the day that mistake saved a girl's life and revealed a truth no one was prepared for. On a quiet Montana afternoon, a widowed woodcarver raised her hand for a moment, just to block the sun. But that simple gesture doomed her to buy the wrong horse, a frail gray mare no one wanted. She had no idea that this unwanted creature would soon lead her into a storm, uncover a hidden past, and give her a second chance at a life she thought was already gone. The late autumn light in the Montana Valley had a way of softening everything it touched, even the dust that hung in the air above the auction yard. It settled like a thin veil over wooden fences, over the restless horses shifting their weight, and finally over the quiet woman standing alone near the far edge of the grounds. Eleanor Reeves kept one hand resting against the worn strap of her canvas bag, the other hooked loosely in her coat pocket, as if tucking her own uncertainty somewhere deep where no one could see it. She had come for a single purpose: find a horse sturdy enough to haul timber from her workshop to the small cabin tucked near Pine Ridge Creek. Nothing more. Nothing less. In the thin chill of the afternoon, her breath rose and faded like a thought she wasn't ready to finish. She watched the bidders gather in tight circles, joking loudly as if the cold couldn't reach them. Men in flannel coats slapped each other on the back, boots scraping against frostbitten earth. This was their world, predictable, booming, filled with the kind of confidence that kept them warm. Eleanor stood apart, a slim figure in a faded brown jacket, her presence so still that a passerby might have mistaken her for part of the fence line. A gust of wind tugged at the brim of her old felt hat, carrying with it the smell of pine sap and wood smoke, scents that clung to her life like second skin. She inhaled them the way some people inhale courage. The auctioneer's voice cracked across the yard, energetic and sharp, bouncing off the mountains that framed the town like ancient guardians. Eleanor let the sound wash over her. She wasn't intimidated by crowds. She simply didn't belong to them. Not since the accident. Not since the day the ranger knocked on her door with a quiet apology and a folded map, his eyes refusing to meet hers. The world had not been loud since then. Only her memories were. A chestnut gelding was led into the ring, its coat shining despite the weak sun. The auctioneer praised its strength, its temperament, its reliability. Exactly the kind of horse Eleanor needed. Yet she stayed where she was, measuring her own limits with a steady, cautious mind. She had enough savings tucked away from her wood-carving orders, custom signs for small businesses, hand-hewn figurines for tourists, and the occasional commissioned piece that helped her pay for firewood or winter supplies. But she couldn't afford to overspend. Life had narrowed into practicality after loss. Even hope was budgeted carefully. The bidding climbed quickly, and the horse was sold before she convinced herself to join in. She didn't let herself feel disappointment. Montana winters punished those who indulged in what-ifs. She pushed her hands deeper into her pockets and tried to focus on what remained ahead, not what slipped past. Another horse followed, then another. Creatures too expensive, too wild, too thin, too unpredictable. Each one was greeted with loud commentary, but Eleanor stayed silent, listening beyond the chatter to the rhythm of her own judgment. Years of shaping wood with precision had trained her to see details others overlooked. How a horse shifted its hind legs, how its ears twitched, how its breathing changed when someone stepped too close. When she finally found the right animal, she would know. But as the auction wore on, a strange heaviness settled in her chest. She could feel the day slipping away, the sun inching toward its late afternoon descent, the temperature beginning to drop. The mountains cast long blue shadows across the yard, and with them came the familiar sense of being left behind, of watching life move on without her. She drew a slow breath, steadying herself. She wasn't here for anything grand. She didn't need luck or miracles. She just needed a horse, one dependable enough to get her through the coming snow, one steady enough to walk alongside her quiet life. She repeated that truth like a quiet prayer, letting it anchor her. When the auctioneer called for the next animal, Eleanor stepped a little closer to the ring. Not enough to be noticed, but enough for the cold metal railing to press against her coat. The horse was small, its ribs faintly visible beneath a dull gray coat. No one paid much attention to it. Even the auctioneer sounded half-hearted in his pitch. A few men shrugged, uninterested. Someone joked that the mare looked like she'd been raised on shadows instead of hay. Eleanor didn't move. She wasn't drawn to the horse, not yet. But something about the stillness in the mare's posture, how she stood without fidgeting, how she quietly scanned the crowd, touched the edge of Eleanor's awareness. The horse wasn't afraid. She wasn't restless. She simply existed, the way someone does after surviving more than she can articulate. The wind shifted again. Eleanor raised a hand instinctively to shield her eyes from the glare breaking through the clouds. That simple motion, small, unthinking, set the future into motion before she even realized it. "Bid acknowledged," the auctioneer shouted, his voice slicing through the muted chatter. Eleanor froze, her hand still halfway to her brow. The crowd turned. The mallet lifted. And in that suspended second, before the gavel fell, before she could speak, before fate finished choosing for her, Eleanor felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. It felt like the beginning of something she hadn't asked for, something she wasn't ready for, and something she couldn't stop. The sound of the gavel struck the air like a crack of lightning against stone, sharp enough to make Eleanor's breath falter. It echoed off the metal roofs and wooden posts, a sound too final for something she had never intended. A few men laughed, good-naturedly but loud enough to sting, while others simply looked over with mild curiosity at the quiet woman whose accidental gesture had just cost her $40 she could not afford to lose. Eleanor lowered her hand slowly, as if it weighed more than the world itself, and tried to speak, but the words tangled in her throat. The auctioneer had already moved on within his own rhythm, his voice rolling forward like a wagon that didn't know how to stop once it gained speed. She opened her mouth again, but the gavel had already fallen. The deal sealed. The mare, a thin, almost colorless gray, blinked once at the sound, not startled, not bothered, simply aware. Eleanor felt heat rising to her face, the kind that comes not from embarrassment alone, but from the sudden realization that life had turned down a road she hadn't chosen. She stepped forward, trying to make her way through the crowd, but boots and shoulders blocked her path. Each stranger absorbed in discussing the next horse being brought from the holding pen. When she finally reached the auctioneer's stand, he gave her a sympathetic tilt of his head, as if he'd seen this happen before and knew how futile objections could be. She tried anyway. Her voice trembled at first, then steadied with the quiet firmness she used when negotiating the price of her woodwork. "I wasn't bidding," she said. "I just raised my hand to block the sun." The auctioneer nodded, not unkindly, but with the weary certainty of a man who had learned that rules mattered more than intentions. "I believe you," he said, "but the yard doesn't allow retractions. Folks trust the process. If we let one bid slide, the whole thing falls apart." He wasn't harsh, just unmovable. Like the mountains to the west, shaped by storms but never shifting for anyone's sorrow. Eleanor inhaled slowly, letting the cool air thread through her chest, steadying her. She reached for her wallet, the leather soft from years of use, and took out the bills she had tucked away for winter supplies. $40. Enough to buy oats, fuel, and a few essentials she still hadn't replenished since the last storm. She handed the money over without another word. The auctioneer accepted it gently, almost regretfully, as if aware of the weight behind it. When she turned to leave, the mare was already being led toward her, the handler offering the rope with a simple nod. Up close, the horse looked smaller than she appeared from the ring. Her coat bore patches of uneven color, flecks of darker gray where the winter fur was coming in. Her ribs pressed faintly against her side, and her mane hung in thin strands like unbrushed silk. But her eyes, those soft, dusk-colored eyes, met Eleanor's with a kind of muted patience, the look of a creature who had endured enough to stop expecting anything surprising from the world. Eleanor took the rope. Willow, though she didn't yet know the name that would eventually fit, shifted her weight, but didn't resist. They walked a short distance from the yard as the crowd buzzed behind them, but Eleanor didn't turn back. Her boots crunched over frost-bitten gravel as she tried to quiet the frustration simmering in her chest. She hadn't wanted this horse. She hadn't chosen this turn of events. Yet here she was, leading home an animal as misplaced in her life as she sometimes felt in the world around her. The sun dipped behind a bank of clouds, dimming the day earlier than expected. Eleanor tightened her scarf and guided the mare toward the narrow mountain trail that wound back to Pine Ridge Creek. The air smelled of distant snow. Every step she took felt heavier than the last, as if the road itself questioned the wisdom of bringing this fragile gray shadow into a winter that would show no mercy. Halfway down the path, Eleanor paused. She looked at the mare, truly looked this time, not through the lens of disappointment, but with the resigned attentiveness of someone who needed to understand what life had handed her. The mare blinked slowly, her breath visible in soft white threads. When a gust of wind swept across the ridge, the horse took a careful step closer, almost brushing against Eleanor's shoulder. It wasn't affection. It wasn't need. It was presence, quiet, steady, oddly grounding. Eleanor let out a long sigh, a sound that felt pulled from the deepest part of her. "Well," she murmured, the words carried softly by the cold air, "we're stuck with each other now." The mare flicked an ear, acknowledging the sentiment in her own quiet way. No thunder rolled, no omen appeared. There was no music swelling like in the movies. Just a tired woman and a thin gray mare standing alone on a ridge as daylight faded. Two lives brushed together by accident, or by something that felt a little too deliberate to be chance. Eleanor tightened her grip on the rope and resumed walking, unaware that in the chapters ahead, this unintended purchase would unravel truths in her life that had remained untouched for years. Unaware that this horse, this mistake, would guide her toward places she had once vowed never to face again. She only felt the growing cold, the weight of a long evening ahead, and the soft, rhythmic footfalls of the mare behind her, steady as a heartbeat she had forgotten she still possessed. The trail leading away from the auction yard narrowed quickly as Eleanor and the gray mare slipped into the first rows of pines. The sounds of the crowd faded behind them. Boots scraping gravel, men arguing over bids, the auctioneer's voice bouncing off metal, roofs. Soon it was just the hush of the forest, the crunch of frost beneath their feet, and the faint clatter of the rope against Eleanor's glove. She kept her pace slow, partly because the mare moved carefully on the uneven ground, and partly because the weight of what had just happened pressed on her chest like an unexpected snowfall. She had planned the day so carefully, down to every dollar she could afford to lose. Yet somehow she was walking home with the one horse she never meant to buy. The mare followed without resistance. Her steps were light but deliberate, as if she knew where the earth dipped and where the roots pressed nearest the surface. Eleanor noticed the way the horse angled her body on certain stretches, almost leaning into the wind to steady herself. It wasn't elegance. Willow, though she had not yet earned that name, moved with a kind of respectful caution, like someone who had learned to survive by listening first and acting second. Every few yards, she lifted her head, ears turning toward sounds too subtle for Eleanor to hear. It made Eleanor slow her own breathing, trying to feel what the mare sensed. But all she caught was the cold settling deeper into the trees. The sun was sinking now, turning the snow patches along the trail into dull silver. Eleanor adjusted her bag, feeling the familiar ache in her shoulder from years of carving and lifting timber. She was used to long days, used to work that kept her hands busy enough to quiet her mind. But today, her thoughts refused to settle. She kept replaying that split-second moment at the auction, how raising her hand to shield her eyes had shifted the course of her winter. It wasn't regret she felt, not exactly. More like a tired bewilderment. She had built her life around careful steps. Fate, it seemed, still preferred leaps. Halfway through the trail, she stopped to rest. The mare halted beside her, lowering her head as if grateful for the pause. Eleanor leaned against a pine trunk dusted with snow, letting the cool bark press against her coat. She studied the mare's slight frame, her narrow chest, her winter coat already thickening in patches, her soft breath threading through the cold. The horse wasn't starving, but she wasn't far from it either. Someone had fed her just enough to keep her going, but not enough to help her thrive. That truth landed quietly, settling into Eleanor's awareness with an odd, familiar heaviness. She knew what it felt like to be kept going by the bare minimum: food, sleep, unspoken grief. She pushed off the tree and resumed walking. The mare followed instantly. No tug needed. A strange companionship formed in the silent stretch between them, one without warmth or trust yet, but something gentler than indifference. At one point, when the trail narrowed along a rocky slope, the mare shifted closer to Eleanor, placing herself just slightly to the outside, as if instinctively guarding her from the drop. Eleanor didn't make anything of it at first. She simply kept going, her breath visible in soft threads floating toward the dimming sky. As they crossed the wooden footbridge over Pine Ridge Creek, the cold air sharpened with the scent of running water. The mare lowered her head to drink, and Eleanor watched the ripples scatter across the surface. The creek had always been a dividing line for her life. On one side, the town with its noise, questions, and small-town familiarity. On the other side, her cabin, her workshop, and the quiet she clung to. She had built that quiet herself, piece by piece, after the day she lost her son. The cabin had become her sanctuary, and sometimes her exile, depending on how the memories rose and fell. When they reached the far bank, the mare hesitated only a moment before stepping onto the snow-laced ground. Eleanor nodded, more to herself than to the horse, and led her toward the clearing where her cabin stood nestled among tall pines. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney, carrying the remnants of the morning's fire. The sight usually comforted her, but tonight it felt different, like something had shifted in the air, a small tilt in the balance she kept so carefully over the years. She guided the mare toward the old wooden corral beside the workshop. The gate creaked softly as she opened it. The mare entered without hesitation, turning once to look back at her with an expression that unsettled Eleanor more than she wanted to admit. It was not gratitude or confusion. It was simply recognition, as if the horse saw in her someone who moved through the world with the same quiet caution. Eleanor closed the gate and stepped back. The cold deepened quickly as the last light slipped behind the mountains. She lingered a moment longer than she intended, watching the mare find a patch of straw and lower her head. There was nothing extraordinary in the movement, nothing magical or dramatic. Just life continuing in the smallest, most fragile ways. She finally turned toward the cabin, boots crunching softly over thin snow. A gust of wind swept through the pines, scattering old needles across her path. She paused, glancing back once more. The mare stood silently, her silhouette faint against the dusk. A mistake, Eleanor reminded herself, an unintended turn of fate. But as she reached her door and set a hand on the worn handle, she felt something shift inside her. Not hope, not yet, but a loosening. A soft, nearly imperceptible change. The kind that only begins on a quiet walk home. Morning arrived quietly, the kind of pale Montana dawn that blurred the line between night and day. A thin frost covered the yard like powdered glass, and the air held that early winter stillness that made even birds reluctant to stir. Eleanor stepped out of the cabin with a mug of coffee warming her palms, her breath drifting like smoke into the air. The corral stood silent, save for a soft rustle where the gray mare shifted her weight. Willow still wasn't. Her name, not yet, but something about the horse's presence felt less foreign today. Quiet things had a way of finding each other. Eleanor walked toward the fence, boots leaving crisp impressions in the frosted earth. The mare lifted her head as she approached, watching with the same muted patience she'd shown since the walk home. Her eyes reflected the pale light, soft but alert. Eleanor rested a hand on the top rail of the fence. She didn't speak, not out of discomfort, but because silence had long been her language. The mare seemed to understand. She simply drew a breath and released it in a slow, gentle cloud. Eleanor finished her coffee and began her morning chores, moving between the workshop and the woodpile. The scent of pine filled the crisp air as she split logs with steady, practiced motions. Each swing of the axe cut through more than wood. It carved through the lingering frustration of yesterday's mistake, through the anxiety gnawing at the edges of her thoughts. She needed to prepare for winter. She needed a working horse. She needed predictability, not one more fragile thing to worry about. But life rarely aligned itself with a person's needs. When she carried the first armful of firewood toward the cabin, she noticed the mare standing at the corner of the corral, following each step with that same quiet intensity. It wasn't the nervous tracking of a horse unsure of its surroundings. It was something else. An attentiveness that felt out of place in such an underfed, overlooked creature. Eleanor paused mid-step. The mare responded by lifting her ears, watching her with a level focus that made the moment feel heavier than it should have been. She set the wood down inside the cabin doorway, then returned to the corral with a small measure of grain. The mare approached, cautious but unafraid. Up close, her breaths were warm, her whiskers stiff against the cold. The bowl clinked softly as Eleanor placed it on the ground. The mare lowered her head to eat, each movement deliberate, almost ceremonial. Eleanor studied her posture, how she shifted her weight, how she braced herself before leaning in, how her ears flicked not with anxiety, but with awareness. This horse had been taught something once, maybe many things, but whatever those things were, they clung to her in shreds now, barely visible. Later that day, after finishing a commission for a local restaurant, a carved bear intended for an outdoor sign, Eleanor walked toward the North Trail to check the fallen branches that had accumulated after last week's windstorm. She grabbed her coat, hammered stakes, and rope. She didn't expect the mare to react. She only glanced at her out of habit. But the moment Eleanor stepped past the first tree line, the mare lifted her head sharply and let out a soft, low sound, almost a warning. Eleanor slowed. She turned back. The mare stood pressed against the corral gate, ears forward, eyes shadowed by something that wasn't fear, but urgency. Eleanor hesitated. She had seen animals react to sudden movements before, but this felt different, as if the mare sensed she shouldn't be alone on the trail. She brushed the thought aside. She wasn't superstitious. She had lived too many years grounded in hard truth to indulge in meaning where there was none. Still, the mare didn't look away until Eleanor disappeared into the trees. The forest floor was slick with thin ice hidden beneath fallen needles. Eleanor stepped carefully, balancing the stakes on her shoulder as she walked along the trail. She found the first fallen branch blocking a narrow bend and cleared it with practiced efficiency. She worked in silence, the familiar rhythm grounding her. But every now and then, a faint feeling tugged at her, something like being watched or being warned. She caught herself glancing back toward the cabin even though it was out of sight. By the time she reached the ridge, a faint wind picked up, whispering through the trees. She noticed the trail ahead looked more brittle than usual, small pockets of disturbed earth marking where deer had passed or where frost had softened the ground. She saw a deep indentation near the edge, fresh, sharp, sharper than any animal print she recognized. She crouched, touching the soil with her gloved fingers. It crumbled too easily. The ridge was unstable. She stood slowly, scanning the slope with narrowed eyes. One step too close would send the loose earth cascading into the ravine below. She exhaled, relieved she hadn't walked any further. She tied a small ribbon around a nearby branch to mark the hazard for Sheriff Walters, who often used the upper trails for patrol. The wind shifted again, colder this time, brushing against her collar as if pushing her gently back toward home. When she returned, the mare was still at the gate, waiting. Eleanor approached, rubbing the cold from her fingers as she leaned against the fence. The mare stepped closer, exhaling softly against Eleanor's sleeve. It was a simple gesture, instinctive, uncalculated, but for a reason Eleanor couldn't explain, it made her chest tighten, not in discomfort, but in recognition. She had not expected a companion. She had not asked for one. Yet here stood a creature who noticed her absence, who tracked her movements, who reacted to her leaving like a creature tied, not by command, but by understanding. A faint, unsettling thought drifted across her mind. This horse knows things, not tricks, not commands, things. She pushed the idea away, convincing herself she was tired. Winter anxieties did strange things to a person's imagination. She latched the corral gate, whispered a soft, "Good night," and stepped away. The mare lowered her head, but her ears stayed angled toward Eleanor until the cabin door closed. In the quiet that followed, Eleanor felt the slightest shift inside her. Like a door she'd kept shut for years had opened just a crack. The storm arrived sooner than anyone expected. One moment, the sky above Pine Ridge Creek held a dim winter calm, and the next, it was swallowed by thick, rolling clouds that tumbled over the mountains like a warning too late to heed. Eleanor stood on her porch, watching the first flakes fall in restless spirals. Snowstorms in this valley were unpredictable, sometimes gentle, sometimes ruthless, and this one carried the kind of urgency that made every instinct in her tighten. She wrapped her coat closer around her and listened to the wind rising through the pines, their tall silhouettes swaying like old sentinels bracing for the night. She had barely stepped back inside when the frantic pounding on her door broke the silence. Sheriff Walters stood there, his breath visible in harsh bursts, his hat damp with fresh snow. Behind him, the world was already turning white. Eleanor didn't need him to speak. The fear in his eyes said enough, but he managed the words anyway, rough and strained. "Ivy's gone missing. She ran off after the argument, took the East Ridge Trail before the storm hit." His voice cracked in the smallest way, just at the end. Not enough for most people to notice, but Eleanor heard it as clearly as a shout. She knew that kind of fear, the kind that made the world narrow into a single, unbearable possibility. For a moment, she couldn't move. The image of a young girl alone in rising snow pressed against her chest, colliding with memories she had spent years trying not to touch. A forest. A sudden storm. A search too late. She steadied herself against the table, pushing the memory back into its quiet drawer, refusing to let it swallow her. Walters ran a shaky hand through his hair. "Everyone's looking, but visibility's dropping fast. I thought maybe, if you'd seen her walk past your trail." His voice trailed off, already apologizing for the hope he didn't know how to keep. Before Eleanor could speak, a sharp sound cut through the wind, a familiar, urgent whinny from the corral. It wasn't loud, but it carried a tone she had not heard from the mare before, something tight and insistent. Eleanor's breath caught. The mare was pacing the fence, head high, ears pinned forward. Snowflakes clung to her coat, melting in quick dark specks. She let out another sound, lower this time, as if urging someone to understand. Eleanor stepped outside, pulled by a feeling she couldn't explain. The mare met her eyes, and in that instant, Eleanor felt the same unsettling awareness she had sensed days ago, now sharpened by something almost like alarm. The sheriff frowned. "What's wrong with her?" Eleanor didn't answer. She reached for the gate latch with numb fingers, the cold biting her skin through the gloves. The mare didn't shy away. She moved toward Eleanor with a sense of purpose that made the hair at the back of Eleanor's neck rise. She hadn't saddled a horse since the accident, hadn't trusted herself on a trail when storms threatened to blur the world into something unrecognizable. But the mare, this quiet, strange creature she hadn't meant to own, kept her gaze fixed, unwavering, as if offering something Eleanor did not yet understand. "What are you thinking?" Walters asked softly, fear and hope tangled in his voice. Eleanor took a breath that stung her throat. "I think she knows something," she said. The sheriff blinked, confusion shifting into a desperate kind of belief. No one had time to argue. The storm tightened around them with each passing minute. She moved with a steadiness she had not felt in years. The saddle was old, but her hands remembered the motions like a long-lost rhythm. The mare stood still throughout, only flicking her ears when a gust of snow-laden wind swept across the yard. When Eleanor placed her foot in the stirrup, her heart trembled, not from fear of falling, but from the weight of what she was about to face inside herself. She swung up, her body settling into a place she had sworn she'd never return to. The mare shifted beneath her, not in uncertainty but in readiness. Walter stepped back, eyes wide with something like hesitant awe. "Be careful," he said, though his voice suggested he knew caution had long been left behind. The mare moved the instant Eleanor gave the slightest pressure with her heel. Not fast, steady, purposeful, cutting through the wind with a sense of direction Eleanor didn't choose. It was as if the horse was following a thread only she could sense, weaving through the thickening snow where the trail blurred into white. Eleanor leaned low to keep the wind from stealing her breath. She listened to the world the way she once taught herself to listen to wood grain, patiently, quietly, waiting for meaning in the stillness between sounds. Halfway up the ridge, the snow deepened, clinging to Willow's legs as she pushed on. A fallen branch cracked nearby, but the mare didn't flinch. She swung left sharply, forcing Eleanor to tighten her grip on the reins. The path she chose wasn't one Eleanor would have taken. It veered off the main trail into narrower passages where overhanging limbs brushed Eleanor's shoulders. She wanted to pull back, redirect, but something in the mare's urgency felt too precise to ignore. Willow's breathing deepened, her ears flicking to the wind as if listening to notes hidden in the storm. Then, barely audible, Eleanor heard it. A thin, trembling sound. Not the wind, not the shifting snow. A cry. She froze, her breath caught. Willow stopped too, ears forward, body tense. Eleanor strained to listen. Another cry broke through the storm, small, raw, and fading. "Ivy," Eleanor whispered, her voice swallowed by wind. She urged Willow forward, and the mare responded with a sure-footed descent toward a cluster of boulders half buried in snow. There, curled beside the rock face, Ivy shivered violently, her jacket thin, her hair matted with icy flakes, her cheeks were pale, her lips trembling uncontrollably. Eleanor dismounted in one swift movement, dropping to her knees beside the girl. Ivy blinked weakly, recognition flickering through the fear in her eyes. "Sorry," the girl whispered, though she had no reason to apologize. "Don't be," Eleanor said, wrapping her own coat around the trembling shoulders. She lifted Ivy carefully onto Willow's back, her movements gentle but determined. The mare stood perfectly still, lowering herself just enough to make it easier, an act so subtle, so intuitive, it sent a ripple through Eleanor's chest. The ride back was slower, the storm pressing against them like a wall, but Willow carried them with an unwavering steadiness. Eleanor held Ivy close, feeling the girl's shallow breaths against her own ribs. She didn't think about the cold. She didn't think about the fear. She only focused on the steady rhythm of the mare beneath them. Each step, a defiance of the dark world the storm tried to create. When they reached the cabin, the sheriff ran toward them, nearly stumbling in the snow. He swept Ivy into his arms, relief shaking his entire body. He whispered thank yous, dozens of them, but Eleanor barely heard. She looked at the mare, her breath clouding the air, her coat dusted in white. The horse stood calm, as if leading them through the storm had been the only path she could take. Eleanor touched the mare's neck with a quiet sense of awe, and whispered words she didn't plan to say out loud. "You knew." The storm thinned overnight, leaving behind a world washed in pale blue light. Snow draped the pines in soft, heavy folds, and the morning sun scattered across the landscape in muted gold. Eleanor stood at her window long before dawn, watching steam rise from the mare's breath in the corral. Willow, yes, the name finally felt fitting, stood with her head lowered, as if conserving her strength after the harrowing night. Eleanor's hands rested on the windowsill, fingers curled slightly, as though holding on to the last threads of what she thought she understood about the world. But everything had shifted. A horse didn't simply know where a child was. And yet Willow had moved through the storm with the certainty of something beyond instinct, beyond training. It left Eleanor unsettled, not because she feared it, but because part of her recognized that kind of knowing. Grief had sharpened her senses once, too. When she stepped outside, the cold bit through her coat, sharp and clean. Willow lifted her head immediately, watching Eleanor cross the yard. Not impatiently, attentively. The mare's ears tilted forward, her breath rising in small white plumes. Eleanor reached the fence, her boots sinking into the powdery snow. She placed a gloved hand against the mare's neck, feeling the warmth beneath the winter coat. "You saved her," she whispered. The words tasted unfamiliar in her mouth, quiet gratitude threaded with disbelief. Willow exhaled softly, leaning just slightly into the touch. The gesture was small, but something inside Eleanor softened. It had been years since she had felt a presence that didn't demand anything, didn't judge, didn't question. A presence that simply stood with her. The silence between them felt alive in its own way, filled with a kind of communication that didn't require words. Later that morning, the sheriff arrived to thank her again. Ivy was recovering, wrapped in blankets beside their wood stove, warmed with soup and relief. Walters tried to explain what had happened, how the search parties had headed in the wrong direction, how he couldn't understand how a half-starved mare had found the precise path through the storm. Eleanor only listened, her gaze drifting toward Willow. She felt the sheriff watching her, searching her expression for answers. But what could she say? That a horse had guided her like a compass guided by something deeper than instinct? That the mare seemed to hear things the world didn't say out loud? Instead, she replied gently, "I think she just listened to the land." It was the closest truth she could give. Walters nodded, though uncertainty clouded his eyes. Before leaving, he placed a hand on Eleanor's shoulder, a rare gesture from a man who guarded his emotions like a locked drawer. "You brought my daughter home," he said. "I won't forget it." He then disappeared into the snowy trail as quietly as he'd arrived, leaving Eleanor with the echo of his gratitude and a heaviness she couldn't quite name. That afternoon, Eleanor decided to test a thought that had lingered in her mind. She saddled Willow with slow, deliberate motions. The mare stood steady, patient, without a hint of resistance. As Eleanor mounted, something in her chest tightened. Not fear, not grief, but anticipation. She guided Willow toward the forest, though only loosely. The reins hung light in her hands, leaving room for the mare to choose. And choose she did. Willow moved with a confidence Eleanor hadn't expected from a horse so thin and overlooked. She stepped over hidden roots, avoided patches of brittle ice, and circled wide around a fallen tree as if she had plotted the path hours before they arrived. Eleanor tried not to interfere, letting her body sway with the mare's rhythm. She felt something curious, a sense of being guided rather than guiding, of being taught by a creature that shouldn't know so much. Eleanor let Willow lead them deeper into the woods. The mare's ears flicked often, listening to nuances of wind and ground that Eleanor couldn't decipher. When they reached a narrow ravine, Willow slowed and angled across the slope, carving a safe line through the snow that Eleanor would never have found on her own. Though the mare's hooves sank deep, her movements were sure and measured, as if she knew where each foothold would hold despite the hidden ice. Halfway across, a gust of wind toppled loose powder from the cliff above. Eleanor tensed, instincts screaming to turn back, but Willow did not flinch. She steadied herself, waited for the snow to settle, then continued forward with a calm decisiveness that made Eleanor's heart stutter. She stroked the mare's neck, whispering reassurance she wasn't sure the mare needed. A strange thought flickered through her mind. Who is leading whom? On the far side of the ravine, Willow paused beside a broken pine branch hanging low over the path. Eleanor slid from the saddle, landing softly in the snow. The mare nudged the branch with her muzzle, drawing Eleanor's attention to the way it hung more sharply than the others, as if recently disturbed. She stepped closer and saw prints. Small, human, familiar. Ivy had passed through here. Eleanor exhaled slowly, realizing Willow had not just remembered the route home. She remembered the route to the girl, as if the mare had been imprinting the ground beneath her hooves, reading the landscape like a memory carved into bark. Eleanor's breath misted the quiet air. She stood beside Willow, letting the weight of this realization settle gently. Not fear, not awe, something else. A recognition that the mare was meant for more than she appeared. A feeling that their paths had crossed for reasons neither could fully see yet. She walked around to face Willow. Snowflakes gathered along the mare's eyelashes, tiny crystals catching the faint winter light. Eleanor brushed them away with her glove. Willow blinked slowly, leaning into her hand for the briefest moment. That small gesture, the soft press of a warm cheek against her palm, unraveled something fragile inside her. It wasn't dramatic, but it was true. They returned to the cabin long after the sun slipped behind the mountains, the path traced in soft shadows. The world felt different beneath Eleanor's boots. Not safer, not easier. Just different in a way that suggested possibility where there had once been only survival. When Eleanor unsaddled Willow, the mare released a long breath, almost a sigh. Eleanor stroked her neck thoughtfully. "You aren't the wrong horse," she murmured. Not a declaration, just a thought carried into the cold evening. Willow's ears flicked gently, as if acknowledging what Eleanor herself had not yet accepted. That something new was beginning, quiet as snowfall, deliberate as a heartbeat. The knock on Eleanor's door came on a morning washed in pale winter sunlight, the kind that softened shadows, but did nothing to warm the air. She had just finished brushing the frost from Willow's mane when the sound carried across the yard. Measured, deliberate, the knock of someone who wasn't lost or hesitant. Willow lifted her head sharply, ears turning toward the cabin before Eleanor even reacted. There was something in the mare's alertness, a subtle tension that made Eleanor pause with her hand resting against the horse's neck. She stepped, away from the corral, and wiped her gloves against her coat as she made her way to the porch. When she opened the door, a man stood at the bottom of the steps, snow dusting the shoulders of his wool coat. His posture was steady, though age had settled into the lines around his eyes and the bend of his back. He held his hat in both hands, turning it slowly, as if preparing himself for what he might find. "Mrs. Reeves?" he asked, his voice roughened by years of cold mountain air. Eleanor nodded. Something about him tugged at her memory, though she couldn't place it. He wasn't from town. She would have remembered a man with eyes that carried such tired intelligence. "My name is Harold Finch," he said. "I was told you've taken in a gray mare from the Guthrie auction 2 weeks back." Eleanor's heartbeat tightened. She stepped outside fully and closed the door behind her, shielding the cabin's warmth from the cold. "Yes," she answered cautiously. "I did." Finch exhaled, shoulders lowering slightly, though whether from relief or something heavier, she couldn't tell. He glanced toward the corral, and his gaze softened in a way that held both recognition and remorse. Eleanor led him toward the fence without another word. Willow had moved to the far end of the enclosure, head high, eyes fixed on the visitor with a wariness Eleanor had not seen since the day they met. Yet it wasn't fear. It was the stark awareness of someone recognizing a figure from a life she was no longer living. Finch stopped beside Eleanor, hands tightening around the hat. His breath clouded the cold air. "That's her," he murmured. "I'd know that stance anywhere." Eleanor studied him. "You knew her?" He nodded, eyes never leaving the mare. "I trained her, years ago, back when she was part of our search and rescue program for the Northwest Range." The words fell slowly, like stones dropped into deep water. She had talent, more than any horse I'd worked with. She could read terrain like she'd been born from the mountain itself. But she was... He hesitated, swallowing a truth that seemed to sit poorly on his tongue. She was sensitive, too sensitive, we thought. Willow shifted her weight, the soft crunch of snow beneath her hooves punctuating the silence. Finch continued, his voice carrying years of regret. "She startled easily with crowds. Didn't take well to pressure. Would freeze if too many handlers barked orders. So we reevaluated." His shoulders fell. "We decided she wasn't fit for the job." Eleanor felt a cold ache bloom in her chest. "You dismissed her." Finch winced, not at her accusation, but at the truth of it. "We rehomed her, sent her down to a lower ridge stable with instructions she be placed somewhere quiet. Somewhere she could just live." He paused, the winter breeze passing between them like a sigh. "But she slipped through the cracks. Ended up changing hands too many times. When I realized where she'd gone, she was already on her way to that auction." A knot tightened in Eleanor's stomach. She glanced at Willow, who stood still as stone, only her breath revealing she was anything more than a carved figure in the snow. "Why come now?" Eleanor asked softly. "Why look for her after all this time?" Finch removed his gloves, rubbing his chilled hands together. "Because I heard what she did, for that girl during the storm." His voice dropped to a whisper. "And because I shouldn't have doubted her. Not then. Not ever." Eleanor felt something shift inside her, a recognition sharp and painful. The mare had not only been misunderstood, she had been abandoned for the very thing that made her remarkable. She understood that feeling far too well. Finch's eyes softened with unspoken apology. "I didn't come to take her back. That's not why I'm here. I lost the right to her a long time ago." He looked down at his hands, rough and weathered. "I came to say I'm sorry, and to see if she remembers me." Eleanor hesitated before opening the gate. Willow didn't bolt or shy away. She took one slow step toward them, then another, stopping just out of reach. Finch extended a trembling hand. "Hey, girl," he murmured. His voice cracked in the smallest way, full of memories Eleanor couldn't see. Willow leaned forward, her muzzle hovering above his palm. She didn't nuzzle him. She didn't retreat. She simply stood there, as if acknowledging a past that had shaped her, but no longer defined her. A quiet, dignified forgiveness. Finch's breath hitched. Eleanor looked away, giving him the privacy of that moment. When Willow finally stepped back, Finch lowered his hand, eyes glistening. "She's found where she belongs," he said quietly. "With you." Eleanor felt the words settle deeply, both comforting and frightening. Belonging was a tender thing, fragile, precious, easily broken. She wasn't sure she deserved it, or if she knew what to do with it when offered. Finch reached into his coat and pulled out a small, leather-bound booklet. He offered it to her. These were her old training records, trails she worked, terrain she mapped by memory. It might help you understand her better. Eleanor accepted it, the weight surprisingly light. She met Finch's eyes, finding in them the same quiet sorrow she carried. "Thank you," she said. He nodded once, stepped back into the snow, and with a final look at Willow, turned toward the trail. His figure disappeared slowly into the white landscape, swallowed by distance and time. Eleanor leaned against the fence, the booklet pressed to her chest. Willow approached her, breath warm against the winter air. Eleanor lifted a hand to the mare's cheek, the connection soft but unmistakable. "You've lived more lives than anyone ever gave you credit for," she whispered. The mare blinked, steady and calm. And for the first time in years, Eleanor felt she wasn't standing in her life alone. The days after Harold Finch's visit unfolded with a kind of quiet clarity, as if someone had wiped frost from a window Eleanor didn't realize she'd been looking through. She kept the leather-bound booklet he'd given her on the small table beside her bed, opening it some nights when sleep refused to settle. Most of the entries were written in tight, efficient handwriting, notes about terrain tests, sound sensitivity, route markings, the mare's uncanny ability to map auditory cues, and anticipate unstable ground. But what struck Eleanor were the softer lines tucked between the technical ones. Prefers calm voices. Watches everything. Learns people faster than people learn her. These small observations felt like the truest parts of Willow's story, confirming things Eleanor had sensed before she ever knew the mare's past. Still, none of it explained the feeling growing in her chest each time she stood beside Willow. The sense that this horse carried something more than training, more than instinct. Something she hadn't yet named. Something that tugged at the edges of her own carefully guarded life. On a morning brushed with thin sunlight, Eleanor saddled Willow again. The cold was sharp, but gentler than the storm's aftermath. A quiet stillness clung to the woods, broken only by the groan of snow sliding off branches. Willow stood patiently as Eleanor adjusted the stirrup, her warm breath catching the light in slow, rhythmic clouds. The mare's calmness settled into Eleanor's bones, steadying her. They rode north toward the ridge, the forest shifting from soft brown to deep green as they climbed. Willow moved with a confidence Eleanor had come to trust, hooves sinking into new snow without slipping. Every so often, the mare slowed to listen, ears twitching toward sounds Eleanor only perceived as faint tremors, a distant woodpecker tapping, the soft fall of a branch. water echoing beneath ice. It was as if the mare carried a map of the land in her mind, not one drawn by hands, but by memory and instinct, blended into something sharper than either. As they reached a narrow clearing near the upper ridge, the wind shifted, brushing Eleanor's face with a familiar chill. She pulled Willow to a halt. The clearing looked different today, more open, somehow more exposed. A single pine stood at its center, dark and tall, its trunk thicker than most that grew in this soil. Something in the shape of its branches, the way they dipped under the weight of old snow, struck Eleanor with a force she didn't expect. She felt the air leave her lungs. She recognized this place. She hadn't been back since the day the search party returned alone, carrying only her son's backpack. The memory rose like cold water, fierce, unwelcome, unstoppable. The way she had collapsed to her knees, the way the forest had seemed to hold its breath in sympathy, the way his name had broken in her throat. She had buried the memory beneath years of work, silence, and solitary days in the cabin. And yet here it was, rising from the snow with the same quiet certainty Willow had shown on the night of the storm. The mare lowered her head and nudged Eleanor's boot. Not urgently, not insistently, just enough to pull her back from the edge of the memory. Eleanor slid from the saddle, her boots sinking softly into the snow. She placed one hand on the pine's rough bark. Closing her eyes, she let the winter air fill her lungs, carrying both pain and something lighter, something like release. When she opened her eyes, Willow stood beside her, unmoving, gaze fixed on her with a depth that unsettled Eleanor in the gentlest way. It wasn't sympathy. It wasn't confusion. Willow looked at her as though she understood loss as a space rather than a moment, as though she recognized a heart that had once broken so suddenly the world had tilted with it. Eleanor knelt in the snow, the cold seeping through her wool pants. She didn't cry, not because she held the tears back, but because grief had changed shape over the years into something quieter. Instead, she reached for Willow, resting her forehead briefly against the mare's neck. Willow didn't shift or flinch. She simply stood there, warm and steady, grounding Eleanor in a way no person had in a very long time. It was then she understood what Finch had meant, what he hadn't said out loud. Willow's gift wasn't just in reading the land. She could read people, their grief, their fear, their hesitation, like she once read the trails carved through the mountains. And in her own quiet way, she had been reading Eleanor since the moment they met. The truth settled in Eleanor's chest with an ache that wasn't painful, just profoundly human. Willow had led her to Ivy, not because she recognized the girl's trail, but because she recognized Eleanor's unwillingness to lose someone again. The mare had followed not scent or sound, but the shape of Eleanor's fear. Eleanor rose slowly, brushing the snow from her gloves. "You didn't save her alone," she whispered, her voice catching in the cold air. "You saved me too." Willow blinked, lowering her head until her muzzle touched Eleanor's sleeve. A simple gesture, soft, unassuming, almost fleeting. But in it lay the truth of everything the mare had revealed, that life sometimes chose companions not for their strength, but for the way their presence quieted the storms inside us. When they turned back toward the cabin, the trail seemed different. Not safer, not shorter, just more familiar, as if Eleanor had walked it long before with someone she trusted. Willow moved steadily ahead, leading them through the soft light that filtered between the trees. At the edge of the clearing, Eleanor looked back once more at the pine. The memory still hurt, but the hurt felt less like a wound and more like a reminder. She had survived. She could keep surviving. As they descended toward home, Eleanor kept a hand on Willow's mane, steadying herself not because she feared falling, but because the connection felt right. Necessary. True. Willow wasn't the wrong horse. She had never been. She was the horse who arrived exactly when Eleanor needed a way back to herself. By early spring, the valley began to thaw in slow, deliberate breaths. Snow retreated from the creek in thin, shimmering lines, revealing dark soil and the first resilient shoots of grass. The air still held the bite of winter, but beneath it lived a promise of warmer days, the kind that nudged people out of their homes after months of hiding from the cold. Eleanor felt that shift long before the season fully turned. It arrived quietly, like most changes in her life did, not with revelation, but with a gentle loosening inside her chest. She found herself stepping outside earlier in the mornings, letting the pale sun rest on her face as Willow grazed nearby. Even the bird song seemed to linger differently, filling the open spaces that had once echoed with nothing but the rhythm of her own solitude. Word of Willow's instincts, and of Eleanor's unexpected bravery during the storm, spread through the valley in the kind of soft, unhurried conversations that traveled from porch to porch, store counter to diner booth. People didn't make a spectacle of it. That wasn't the way Montanans lived. But their curiosity grew, and with it came gentle knocks on Eleanor's door from those who knew her name, but rarely used it in conversation. At first, she resisted. She wasn't looking to be anyone's guide. She wasn't ready to be part of anyone's story, but her own. But slowly, cautiously, she began opening the door. The first to come was a high schooler named Jacob, whose father had heard whispers about the mare who could read the mountains. Jacob wasn't there for magic. He was there because he struggled with his footing in life the way some horses struggled on shale. He asked shyly if Eleanor could show him how to ride in the quieter parts of the forest, away from the busier trails where other kids laughed too loudly. Eleanor almost said no, but Willow stepped forward, nudging Jacob's jacket with a gentleness that dissolved her hesitation. So Eleanor saddled Willow and walked Jacob through the shallows of Pine Ridge Creek, teaching him to breathe with the rhythm of the rains, showing him how to listen for the subtle shifts in the ground. Jacob returned twice more that week, each time with a softer gaze. Then came Mrs. Hanley, widowed the year before, who confessed that she'd forgotten how to walk through the woods without feeling the shape of absence beside her. Eleanor didn't offer comfort. She simply walked with her, and Willow followed, weaving between trees with the soft familiarity of a creature who knew when silence mattered more than words. By the end of the afternoon, Mrs. Hanley wiped her eyes, quietly, thanking Willow more than she thanked Eleanor, which suited Eleanor just fine. Soon others arrived, people not seeking adventure, but refuge. Men whose voices had grown tight with the weight of expectations. Women whose hands trembled, not from fear, but from years of holding together the frayed edges of their families. They came because they heard Eleanor's trails offered something different than the guided rides provided by nearby ranches. Here, there were no scheduled routes, no posted signs, no loud chatter, only trees, wind, breath, and the slow, grounding rhythm of Willow's hooves making meaning where words fell short. One afternoon, Ivy Walters appeared at the edge of the clearing, her hair tied loosely, her cheeks carrying the soft flush of recovery. The storm had left her with more caution, but also more depth, a quietness not unlike Eleanor's own. She shifted her weight uncertainly before approaching the corral. "Dad said I could come," she murmured, her fingers curling through the fence slats. "Only if you said it was okay." Eleanor studied her for a moment, taking in the tentativeness in her posture, the way her eyes flicked between her and Willow as if asking permission from both. "It's okay," Eleanor said softly. Willow stepped forward, lowering her head until Ivy's hand rested gently on her muzzle. Ivy smiled in a way that felt like watching a blossom open under careful sunlight. Eleanor felt something warm stir in her, an echo of the bond she once shared with her own son. Not a replacement, not even a parallel. Just a quiet reminder of the parts of her heart she thought had frozen over for good. Ivy became a regular presence in the weeks that followed. She was clumsy at first, but earnest, carrying an eagerness that Eleanor found unexpectedly comforting. They spent hours riding along low ridges, pausing to observe the shifting patterns of melting snow or the early signs of blooming phlox. Willow led them through the woods with the calm certainty of someone guiding a gentle ritual rather than a trail. And Ivy, careful, steady Ivy, began to find a new rhythm within herself, one Eleanor recognized as healing. Sometimes Ivy talked, small confessions spoken into the air between trees, about her loneliness in school, about a mother she barely remembered, about the pressure of people assuming she'd become strong by default, simply because her father was. Eleanor didn't interrupt. She didn't offer advice. She simply listened, letting Ivy's voice merge with the rustle of branches overhead. Willow would tilt her ears in the girl's direction, as if receiving each word with solemn attention. It was a kind of therapy neither of them named, a quiet balm that asked nothing in return. One late afternoon, as the sun dipped low behind the peaks, casting long amber shadows across the clearing, Ivy dismounted and walked beside Willow, brushing the mare's neck with slow, thoughtful strokes. "She finds people," Ivy said softly, almost to herself. "Not just trails, people." Eleanor paused. The truth in the girl's words rang through her like a distant bell. She thought of the storm, of the pine clearing, of her own heart thawing in ways she hadn't realized were possible. "Yes," Eleanor finally whispered. "She does." Willow nickered softly, nudging Ivy's shoulder as though agreeing. The valley warmed further in the following days. Pine Ridge Creek ran faster, reflecting sunlight in fleeting silver bands. Eleanor noticed more footprints leading to her cabin, hesitant, wandering trails left by those seeking something gentle in a world that often spoke too loudly. She welcomed them without announcing she was doing so. She offered space, not solutions. And somehow, Willow became the silent center of it all, the creature whose presence steadied people before they even understood why. Eleanor stood beside the mare one evening, as twilight settled over the valley. Firelight flickered from inside the cabin, casting warm shapes across the yard. Willow grazed quietly, tail swishing lazily. "We didn't choose this, did we?" Eleanor murmured. "But maybe it chose us." Willow lifted her head, meeting her gaze with that same deep, knowing calm. For the first time in years, Eleanor felt something within her shift into place, not a return to who she'd been, but a step toward who she was becoming. A voice rising steadily within her, shaped not by loss but by possibility. A new voice in the mountains. Spring settled into the valley with a softness Eleanor hadn't felt in years. Not sudden, not loud, just a slow easing of the world, as if the mountains themselves were exhaling after a long, stubborn winter. Snow retreated into the shadows of the highest ridges. The pines shed their frozen weight, and the air carried something gentle, warmth braided with the scent of thawed earth and distant rain. Eleanor stood in her yard one early morning, watching light spill over the horizon in long, golden strokes. Willow grazed nearby, her coat catching the dawn in shimmering patches. She had filled out through the winter, her ribs no longer sharp under her skin, her movements stronger, more assured. But her eyes, those deep, steady eyes, remained the same. A softness built from things she'd understood long before anyone taught her how to listen. Life around Pine Ridge changed with the season. Not dramatically, but enough that Eleanor felt it each time she walked the quiet trails. Footprints appeared more often near her cabin, some small, some wide, some that lingered before turning back. People from the town had adopted her forest paths, as if they had always belonged to them, each seeking their own reason to walk between the trees. Eleanor didn't guide every visitor anymore. Some came simply to sit by the creek or watch Willow meander along the tree line. Others asked for advice on things she wasn't sure she knew: grief, direction, resilience. But she learned her presence mattered more than her answers. She had never asked to be a source of comfort, yet here she was, surrounded by quiet gratitude that drifted toward her like soft wind through needles. Ivy visited nearly every day. She wasn't the timid girl Eleanor found shivering in the snow months ago. She moved with a growing steadiness, her steps more confident, her voice less unsure. Willow adored her. Eleanor could see it in the mare's posture, how she lifted her head when Ivy approached, how she adjusted her gait when Ivy rode bareback, how she breathed calmer when Ivy whispered secrets she didn't share with anyone else. Watching them together stirred something tender in Eleanor, a sense of continuity she had never expected to feel again. Not a replacement for her son, not even a comparison. Just a reminder that caring didn't end when a heart broke. It only learned to move differently. One late afternoon, when the sun dipped behind the peaks in a halo of copper and rose, Ivy tugged on Eleanor's sleeve. "Come with us," she said, her voice bright but gentle. "I want to show you something." Before Eleanor could respond, Willow stepped between them, lowering her head as if insisting she join. So Eleanor saddled the mare and let Ivy lead the way, following a narrow path that wound through the forest toward a field she hadn't visited since the year her son died. As they reached the clearing, the sky shifted into a soft wash of lavender. Wildflowers had begun to bloom, early lupine and fragile anemone, dotting the field with color. Ivy stepped aside to let Eleanor ride ahead. Willow's pace slowed naturally as the open space expanded before them, her breaths steady and warm beneath Eleanor's legs. The field had changed, yet it still held the quiet she remembered, an untouched silence that felt more sacred than empty. She dismounted and walked a few steps into the grass. Willow followed, her hooves whispering against the ground. Eleanor closed her eyes and listened. Not for footsteps, not for echoes of loss, but for the way the wind reached her now, how the air moved through her without snagging on old wounds. She felt lighter, not healed, not whole, but open in a way she hadn't been since the day the ranger stood on her porch with his hat in his hands. When she opened her eyes, Willow stood beside her, head lowered, mane shifting softly in the breeze. The mare didn't nudge her, didn't press for attention. She simply stood there, sharing the moment the way she had shared every quiet revelation since the day Eleanor brought her home by accident. Ivy approached from behind, her footsteps gentle in the grass. She didn't speak at first, just slipped her hand into Eleanor's, grounding her with the kind of understanding that needed no explanation. After a long silence, Ivy said, "Dad thinks you saved my life that night." She paused, gaze drifting to Willow. "But I think she saved yours too." Eleanor laughed softly, the sound escaping her before she realized it. Not a laugh of disbelief, but of recognition, a truth landing exactly where it belonged. "Maybe she did," Eleanor said. Her voice was quiet, but steady. "Maybe we saved each other." Willow lifted her head, ears twitching, eyes reflecting the fading light. A horse couldn't smile, but something in the mare's posture felt like warmth spreading through the field around them. As twilight deepened, Eleanor leaned her forehead against Willow's neck. The mare's breath stirred the stray wisps of Eleanor's hair. She closed her eyes and let the moment fold around her. No dramatic revelation, no thundering epiphany. Just a simple, undeniable truth settling into her marrow. Willow had never been the wrong horse. She had been the horse Eleanor needed long before Eleanor realized she needed anything at all. They walked home slowly, Ivy humming a soft tune, Willow's hooves matching the rhythm like a heartbeat. Light lingered on the horizon, refusing to fade too quickly, as if granting them one last gift before the night took hold. When they reached the cabin, Eleanor paused at the gate. She looked back at the trail, the mountains, the shifting sky. She thought of the woman she'd been. Tired, guarded, convinced her life had ended the moment she lost what she loved most. And she thought of the woman she was now, still quiet, still cautious, but breathing more deeply than she had in years. A mare once dismissed as fragile had led her here, not toward a miracle, not toward a cure, but toward the gentlest kind of return, to herself, to the world, to the future she had stopped imagining. Willow brushed her muzzle against Eleanor's shoulder, a silent punctuation. "Thank you," Eleanor whispered into the gathering dusk, "for finding me." And as the mountains darkened beyond the valley, it felt like the world whispered back through the rustling pines. You were never lost. You were just waiting for the right guide. If this story touched you in any way, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Just leave a simple comment below. Anything you'd like to share. And if you'd like to join me for more heartfelt stories like this, feel free to subscribe. There are many more journeys waiting for us, and I'd be honored to have you with me for the next one.